What's up, guys? Deploy, enlist, rain, whatever you want to call me here. I'll be doing a top 5 mistakes that people make in Scythe video. I've been noticing the quality of my online Scythe games has been going down quite a bit. I'm currently rated something like 1330 on the Scythe ranking online, which puts me in like the top 3 players. Might be first, I'm not sure, it doesn't really matter. So I think that gives me some credibility here. In addition, I have other Scythe videos on this channel that you can check out, guides for factions and talking about bottom row actions. So without further ado, let's get right into it. These top 5 things will help you out with your games, playing with friends, or just whenever you want to play. Number 5, starting off with a real simple one here, is prioritizing the factory. The factory is something that some players think is a very good thing to rush. You get your first choice and you pick up a nice action. But you really have to understand that most factions don't even really care about getting a factory card, and all factions don't really need to use that factory action very frequently. It's not going to get you a huge advantage, and oftentimes getting to the factory in the early game or even the early mid game is going to make it so that you're not actually completing the other things that you need to do to have a successful game in Scythe. Now, to understand when the factory actions are particularly good, the fact that factory actions are going to help you complete a star and also allow you to take this move action as well as have a movement on your factory means that they're really particularly okay when you start reaching the late mid game and transitioning into the late game, because movement becomes a big priority for helping you spread your workers onto different territories so you can pick up a lot of points that way. Um, and the action can help you get popularity or complete stars while you do that movement spread, which is so crucial to the late game. It will also allow you to potentially spread workers and then find a combat without having to wait another round before moving again, which could allow you to help finish out your last star or two. That's really when factory actions do pretty well, but a lot of factions don't really care about getting a factory card at all, and even the factions that do care about it aren't going to want to sacrifice their entire early game just to get it. So that's mistake number 5. Don't really even consider the factory card until you start reaching the end of the mid game, or if you're a Palania or Rust Phage, you can pick it up in the mid game, but don't make it an early game priority. Number 4 coming in is an over-prioritization of upgrades. I talk about this in my upgrades video, and yet people still do it. I mean, people haven't seen my videos, obviously, at a very frequent pace, but let's talk about upgrades. If you find yourself ever putting a star here, you have made a mistake in your game. But let's talk about what upgrades are good. So your first 2 to 3 upgrades are going to be good. Why is that? So let's take a look at the upgrades in the top row. Upgrading bolster power, unless you're Crimea, you upgrade combat cards. Upgrading bolster power is nice. It's going to translate to a lot of combat power. It can actually reach you into the point of getting 16 combat power, so that one's pretty nice. Upgrading your movement is going to be really, really good for your late game, and sometimes can be decent in the mid game if you need to move around a bit to stretch your resources up. But really, upgrading movement is useful for the late game since it allows you to spread your workers much, much more quickly. So those 2 upgrades are particularly good. After that, you're looking at popularity gain, maybe production. Production might be a higher priority for Nords. But most factions are going to look at popularity gain as their next upgrade, as the trade action is pretty miserable once you start hitting the mid game. So if you want to take the bottom row action, upgrading the popularity gain will actually allow you to get something very substantial if you want to take that action. So 2 to 3 upgrades is you're going to be getting some solid bonuses on the top. And on the bottom, it upgrades. The first 2 or 3 will allow you to smooth out your game. They're not essential, but they do help. And once you reach 2 to 3 upgrades, you're definitely going to be in the mid game. So once you're in the mid game, you need to understand that resources are not your limiting factor. It's the amount of actions you have. because you're going to be able to do a lot on all of your turns if you've planned and played correctly. So resources is not going to be a factor in terms of what actions you can take. So reducing the cost of your actions beyond the first two even is just completely unnecessary, and sometimes you don't even need the first one. But sometimes it can be rather useful. The first two reductions are going to be obviously the best, but they decrease and decrease in how useful they are, and to the point where they're basically useless after the second or third one. So once you get past 2 or 3 upgrades, and sometimes you don't even get an upgrade at all in your games, but once you get past 2 or 3 upgrades, the upgrades that you're getting are just completely useless. They're not upgrading anything in your top row that's significant, they're not upgrading anything in your bottom row that does anything. So getting 4 more of those actions means that you're not getting mechs, not getting buildings, not getting enlists, which just means that not only are you not progressing to real stars and real benefits for your game, but you're spending a lot of time upgrading and getting no real benefit and needing to do that a lot of times to actually manage to get the star. So don't over prioritize upgrades. If you are going to get upgrades, as we mentioned, get 2 to 3, and you don't even need to get upgrades in all of your games. And as I've kind of blanked out, mistake number 3, going up from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, so these are in ascending order of mistakes. So number 3, we have not getting a mech in the early game, specifically for most factions, not getting your speed mech in the early game. So in your games, you're going to be getting 5 workers generally. On your village, you'll have 4 workers. Now you have 2 choices. You can either move your workers manually or get a mech, most likely your speed mech unless you're Rust Fade, and moving them that way. Obviously, it's much, much better to get your speed mech. Your speed mech is going to be essential for your late game, as your speed mech and movement is going to allow you to spread your workers onto territories to maximize your points, and it's very, very, very good in the early game because it's not going to take you much longer. Like if you were to move these workers manually, which is the mistake I see a lot, it's going to take you 2 move actions, it's going to take you 4 rounds to do so, and if you can't get a mech with the resources that you would get in, I guess it's 3 rounds technically, in the 3 rounds that you would be spending moving, it's not much slower, if it is slower at all, just to get the resources to get your speed mech out and move your workers that way. Speed mech is important because it'll allow you to not just clump all your workers onto one resource, it'll allow you to spread out your workers onto 2 different resources, and potentially start getting 2 bottom row actions for each produce that you get rather than just 1 in some incidental resource that you might be able to use later. It's just way too slow to consider a mech other than speed as your first mech. Unless you're Rust Fade, in which case you need to get onto food and you need to Riverwalk mech as fast as possible. So not getting your speed mech in the early game and manually moving your workers instead, 95% of the time is absolutely wrong. And if you don't know what 5% is, where it's actually right to manually move your workers, it's just don't bother. You're always going to be doing better off for getting your speed mech in the early game. Mistake number 2 in this ascending order here is not getting more than 2 workers. And you might think this is mistake number 1, but you're a bit off. Staying on 2 workers for the entire game just means you're not really playing the game of Scythe. So number 2 and number 1 kind of fit in this category. If you stay on 2 workers, you're not going to have a mid-game. In the mid-game, other players with 5 workers will be doing a produce action, getting 5 resources, and using those 5 resources to take 2 bottom row actions generally. And if you're on 2 workers, then you're getting 2 resources for a produce, 2 resources for a trade. Doing those 2 top row actions will get you 1 bottom row action, whereas other players will be getting a ton of bottom row actions. So you're just not really going to be playing Scythe, you're going to be sitting hunky-dory doing nothing. It's just not acceptable to stick on anything less. I think you need 5 workers. I've seen players play with 4 workers and just confused. I don't really know why you would go for 4 workers rather than 5. And 5 workers is a nice clean way to go about things. Once you have a worker on a village, taking your first produce will get you up to 3 workers, taking one more produce will get you up to 5 workers. 5 workers means that your produce will only cost a combat power, which is not a big deal, and you'll be getting, as I mentioned, 2 bottom row actions generally for just taking a produce action, which is really, really good, and one of the essential parts to your mid game. So always get 5 workers, occasionally get 8 workers. I really wouldn't bother with any other number besides 5 or 8. And the number one mistake that is frequent, and if you make this mistake, you're not playing Scythe. Despite the fact that some people might disagree with me on this, they're just wrong. The number one mistake I still see in a lot of my Scythe games is not enlisting. Now, enlisting in the game of Scythe is the most powerful bottom row action, and it's not close. Not close at all. I haven't seen a game where a player has been competitive without getting all 4 enlists. Usually, I'm in the game and I'm getting all 4 of my enlists, and if a player isn't getting all 4 enlists, I just consider them a non-factor. Why are 4 enlists important? Well, if you don't get this coin enlist, oftentimes you're going to be sitting with 5 to 10 gold in your games. When you get the coin enlist, you're going to be sitting with 15 to 25 gold in your games. Obviously, that seems a bit steep. Probably 5 to 15 to 15 to 25 is more reasonable to stay. This coin, deploy coin here, is easily worth 10 coins. Probably 8 to 12 is more like the range you're looking at. It's just so big for your games, and it's going to be huge in helping you win. If you don't get this, you're doing something wrong. If you're not playing Crimea, this one isn't good, but with Crimea, it's your top priority because combat cards translate to 1 of 80 resource. But we're going to talk about this. Now we're going to talk about the recruit power. This translates from anywhere from 3 to 8 power given the propensity of your neighbors to upgrade. If they're bad, they'll be giving you a ton of combat power for doing this, just getting this. But if they're good, you're probably going to be getting 3 to 5 combat power in a game. If you get it early enough, and sometimes you're getting 1 to 3, but that's still fine. It's still a nice upside for getting this and not having to do anything else besides let your neighbors play the game. This one is a bit situational. Sometimes it's the best one, sometimes more likely it's going to be a middle one, and sometimes it's not very good at all and you just get it last because your neighbors are showing no propensity to ever build in the game, which is reasonable. A lot of times it's not very feasible to build, and you'd rather deploy and enlist. But the popularity you get from this is really huge. If you even get like 2 popularity from this, it's already a huge benefit. And getting all 4 of these, most importantly, will get you 2 coins, 2 popularity, 2 combat strength, and 2 combat cards. And adding up the fact that you're getting a ton of coins, a ton of combat power, sometimes popularity, and sometimes a couple combat cards, this just equates to a ton of resources, an absolute monstrous amount of resources that no other bottom row action could ever compare to. So the first thing you do when you sit down in your game of Scythe should always be to say, okay, I have a star for getting 4 enlists. I'm going to be getting this star. What other stars can I be getting in this game? And if you don't get 4 enlists in your game, you're playing wrong. It's the biggest mistake I see, and it's the most frequent mistake I see, so make sure you're getting all 4 of your enlists in your games. It's more important than having more than 2 workers, and that's really might be shocking to you, but yeah, it's just the truth. You're not playing Scythe if you're not getting enlists. Alright, that's my top 5 video. Hopefully you can take these lessons and adapt them into your games. Maybe they'll help you become a better player. If you're making some of these mistakes, you can adapt your game and say, oh, okay, actually enlists are essentials to the game. I didn't know that. Now I can try doing this. And you'll see that your game will improve if you avoid these 5 pretty common mistakes. And I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Have a wonderful day.